Okay, we'll get started while people are trickling in. Just a quick reminder of the schedule. This session will run until, let's say, 2:40 because we're starting a bit late. And around 3 we'll have some awards for posters. So this is your sort of last chance. That will be your last chance to use that QR code to vote for your favorite poster. This session is about the AI augmented researcher, and it's quite different from the other sessions. In the other sessions, we've looked at using AI as a modeling tool, and here we're looking at using AI as a research enabling tool. So whether we consider a research subject, how AI might act like a supervisor, like a literature review tool, or how it might act as instead of a simulation, this is going to be really looking at AI as a tool instead of as a modeling technique. Our keynote speaker is Peter Törnberg, an assistant professor in computational social science at the University of Amsterdam. He studies the intersection of AI, social media, and politics, and draws on computational methods and digital data for critical inquiry. His recent books include Intimate Communities of Hate, Why Social Media Fuels Far-Right Extremism, and Seeing Like a Platform, an inquiry into the condition of digital modernity. With that, I would like to hand over the floor to Professor Törnberg.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me all right? Is the mic working? Great. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really nice. It's like such a diverse group of scholars, but I also think I'm like the only social scientist here. So hopefully you will still be able to relate to this work, and we'll have some interesting points of connection. So the idea behind this is this notion of, so what if we could use large language models and generative AI to simulate the social world, and specifically for my research to simulate social media. So we could have like a kind of digital twin of a social media platform like Facebook running on our laptop, maybe not on my laptop, but on a server at least. And we could use it to carry out experiments and see what happens if we make modifications to the platform. So we could add a dislike button, or just change the kind of the newsfeed algorithm. And we can see how it changes the social dynamics on the platform. And we could use this as a kind of research tool to carry out experiments and better understand both how social media affects society and affects our discourse, but maybe also how it could be different, how we could modify and improve social media to have better societal outcomes and be more compatible with democratic values. So that's the kind of the idea behind this talk. But to get there, we kind of have to go back a little bit in time and think about social media and its relationship to society. Oh, it worked before. There we go. So as some of you might remember, when social media and like in the internet first kind of arrived on the scene in the 90s, there was a lot of optimism around it, right? Like now it's kind of almost hard to remember because we have such a negative association to social media. But when it first emerged, there was all of these ideas about like it would be a utopian promise of a new kind of enlightened democracy. And a lot of, in the social sciences, a lot of people remembered back to kind of Habermas's very influential work on the public sphere. And he wrote very influentially about kind of the rise and fall of the public sphere, and about how in Paris and in London, when newspapers and pamphlets first kind of emerged from the early printing presses, they were read aloud in these coffee houses, and people were debating, and it created this kind of this public where people engaged with each other and developed a kind of a counterforce to the king. And this was kind of like the source and the foundation of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, is this kind of this emergence of a public. And he then wrote how because of broadcast media, the radio and television, this public sphere was undermined because people retreated to their private homes. They no longer had this kind of space for debate and so on. And so there was kind of an idea when the internet arrived that now maybe we could have like a digital augmented version of this public sphere. We could meet on and share comments, and it would lead to this kind of this meeting of difference and this form of deliberation. Some people refer to this as deliberation. Others speak of kind of democratic dialogue, which has been described as kind of the soul of democracy. And so this was a very dominant idea, but unfortunately, it's maybe not exactly how it's played out, because I would at least not call the last 10 years or so of social media a democratic renaissance, because social media research of the last 2 decades or so has pointed to a kind of societal crisis in terms of our relationship to social media. We're seeing rising kind of toxicity, misinformation. Online media has become like the kind of spaces for radicalization, especially in the far right, and polarization. And a lot of research has focused on, especially like a lot of my research has focused on why this is the case, like what is going on here. And we can basically point to 2 ways very broadly in which the literature has shown that social media is like undermining democratic dialogue. The first one is the one that's most famous and that you probably all heard of, is this notion of echo chamber or filter bubble. And so this stems especially from Cass Sunstein's work in the 90s already. But it's this idea, of course, that we kind of get separated from ideas and people that we don't agree with. And so we don't have this diversity of exchange of different ideas. And filter bubble is relatedly is that the internet kind of algorithmically supports this and hides the idea that we don't agree with us. And the result is kind of as Sunstein put it, a breeding ground for group polarization and extremism. And so my own work has focused in part on trying to understand what actually takes place in these echo chambers, because I'm trying to build a more kind of sociologically grounded theory of what takes place in these spaces. And so in part, I've looked at this extremist community Stormfront and examined using computational methods, natural language processing, all of the conversations over 20 years of this extremist neo-Nazi forum to see how if we can build a more sociologically grounded theory of what takes place in these spaces. And my finding is kind of that that these spaces are, it's really forming a community where it becomes hard to see the humanity in other people, and drawing on kind of Durkheim's ideas of how communities are formed and how we put the group between us and them. And so this is my most recent book out this year. It's available now, Intimate Communities of Hate, where we develop this kind of idea and go into this community. So that's kind of one theory that's been very dominant, and I've been part of developing this idea of the separation and how that undermines democratic dialogue. But then, so that is when we're looking at a community like Stormfront, which has been referred to as the murder capital of the internet. But luckily, I would say that mainstream platforms are not like that, right? Like Twitter, Facebook, and so on, they aren't really very well described as these communities where we're completely separated from each other. And so we have also tried to look together with my PhD student, Anna Kashinius, and Livia van Vliet. We've looked at mainstream platforms like Twitter. So this is an example of a conflict, a very conflictual space on Twitter relating to Black Pete. So there's this Zwarte Piet, which is this tradition in the Netherlands of putting on blackface and marching the streets. And there's been a debate whether that's racist or not. Spoiler alert, it's racist. But that's been a big debate in the Netherlands. And so we look at that debate on Twitter, and what we find isn't really this kind of complete separation between communities. We find a lot of interaction. And so this kind of points to another kind of issue with this, with how the social media enables the democratic dialogue. Because according to kind of a Habermas and the early optimists, this is kind of what we would expect in terms of how this conversation is playing out on social media. We would expect this critical, rational deliberation between the two communities, and then they kind of, over time, arrive at this shared understanding. But when we use natural language processing to actually look at how these conversations are playing out on social media, it looks more like this. it's I don't know where she bought this T-shirt. It's a terrible T-shirt, but it's highly toxic, uncivil, conflictual kinds of interaction. And so we don't have this kind of critical, rational debate and deliberation that is bringing us together. And so this becomes kind of another way in which social media is undermining democratic dialogue. And so I have a paper in PNAS where I kind of show that using a model simulation, agent-based simulation, shows that this itself can function as a mechanism for polarization. That we can have kind of turn the echo chamber on its head in the sense that conflict can be a driver of group polarization, and that this is in fact much more compatible with historical sociological work on how polarization takes place. It's not taking place merely through isolation, but rather through cycles of conflict. And so I refer to this as, in my forthcoming book, I refer to this as the trigger bubble, because social media, highlighting that social media is polarizing by kind of throwing us into this war between two conflictual political partisan groups. And that this can become a form of driver of polarization itself, because social media, since it's optimizing engagement, right, it tries to grab our attention. And what's the best way of grabbing our attention? Well, pissing us off is a pretty good starting point. And so showing very upsetting content from the opposing side and highlighting that is a good way of making us more engaged, but it's also a very good way of making us polarized. And so the takeaway here, because this seems like two contradicting points, right? But the takeaway is that social media in multiple ways undermines our ability to engage in rational deliberation and in democratic dialogue. And this type of open, nuanced, and diverse and inclusive conversation that is necessary for a functioning democracy. And so this has been like the kind of focus of my work for several years, and also the field's focus for several years. But it seems a little bit unsatisfactory to a certain degree, because the follow-up question that I think we should be focusing on right now, because all right, now we've kind of shown social media as it's designed, it's not very compatible with democracy. There's a problem here. But to me, the question should be, so what's the solution? How can we redesign, how can we change social media to make it more compatible with democratic values? What do we do about it? And I think that this is something, I mean, this is a classic point that people complain about social scientists compared to kind of engineers and so on, that we're very into complaining, you know, we're never very solution oriented. But I think that the reason for that is that the methods that we have, and especially in this field, the methods that we have just aren't very compatible with thinking how things could be different. Like the methods that we have in this field, we tend to use observational data that social media platforms are giving us, you know, the very small data that they decide to give us, which is not very useful for, I mean, in part it's not great for causal understanding, but it's also not very, like, we can't really link specific affordances to this dynamics. We can kind of show on a coarsely that social media has negative consequences that is linked to radicalization and so on, but it's very hard to say exactly what affordances, what elements of social media are driving this. And it's, you know, thinking of how social media could be different and how it could be designed to have more positive consequences for democratic dialogue. It's very difficult using observational data. And of course, famously, we now have like a data crisis because platforms are no longer, you know, Elon Musk and so on, they're no longer sharing data. Maybe this will change with the kind of DSA, the EU requirements. But if you've tried to go through those application processes, you know it's at the moment basically non-existent. And so we have this kind of both societal crisis on one side, but we also have this kind of methodological crisis within the field, in that we cannot really continue the research. We cannot really answer this question of how things could be different, how things could be improved. And so the method here that I've been focusing on quite a bit is this agent-based modeling, right? How many of you are you familiar with agent-based modeling? Yeah, so some are familiar. Have you used it yourself? No, so I'm really the only social scientist here. Even so, so what's agent-based modeling? So agent-based modeling is this idea that we create kind of a simplified simulation of the system that we're studying, with agents representing usually individuals, and we study how their interaction leads to often unexpected emergent outcomes. So it very much comes from this idea, from this kind of complexity science, complexity theory. So this idea that the social world emerges through interaction, the social world is a complex system, and so on. So it's kind of a synthetic environment where we're creating rules of interaction and we're having it play out. And so, for instance, this trigger bubble paper is kind of based on this approach. And so, just a kind of classic example is like I just love this example, so I always bring it up. But it's the Schelling 1973 papers. It's one of the first kind of agent-based models, and he actually played it out, I think, on a Go board. It's not even a computer model. But so he was interested in Thomas Schelling. He was interested in the phenomenon of segregation across different systems, and so he created this grid of agents. It's just the simplest model you can imagine. There's two types of agents, red and blue, and they're covered with grid. There are some empty points, and so the only dynamics is if less than a third of the neighbors are of their own type, then they move to a random empty spot on the grid. That's the entire dynamics. So what do you think will happen? I mean, I guess the name gives it away a little bit, but you wouldn't expect there to be that high levels of segregation, right? Because there's one in three, so you have to be really a small minority in your neighborhood to decide to move. So they're relatively open, they're relatively inclusive in some sense. But what you see is that the outcome is complete segregation. Because you have a kind of emergent effect that follows from the interaction. So basically you have, because of the transitivity, you have one agent moving, that makes the neighborhood more segregated, and then that forces the next agent to move, and you have a kind of an effect where it leads to very high levels of segregation. So this is just an example of an agent-based model. And with this we can kind of, since it's a world that we're kind of controlling, we can try to change things. There's been decades of research using this model. So what happens if we introduce like a road that goes through the neighborhood? Like, how does that interact with segregation, and so on? So ABMs are it's an interesting method in this field, and it might be quite useful, but it's kind of lost a lot of, people aren't really using it very much anymore. It used to be a cool kind of thing. And so why aren't there so much interest in agent-based models anymore? Well, the problem is to a large degree that the models tend to be, you saw this model, it's very simplistic, right? So that works for certain things and it draws out certain interesting elements. But the agents aren't really able to reason. They aren't able to interpret. They aren't able to use language. And so as models, they become very simplistic. And specifically for our case of looking at social media, what we're interested in is the emergence of public discourse, right? We're interested in deliberation and these types of exchange, how the dynamics of those types of exchange. And that's just not really available to use this method to study. They're good for studying kind of the dynamics of structures and relationships, less so for studying the dynamics of culture and public discourse. And I would say also, I mean, half my research is agent-based model. The other half is criticizing agent-based models. So I have a very complicated relationship to this. I sometimes call myself a self-hating computational social scientist, but basically, I think that there's a deeper kind of epistemic issue here, because when we talk about the social world being complex, it often implies that it's complex in the same way as the natural world, right? Like complexity science is this field at the intersection between the natural sciences and the social sciences, and often using this flocks and ant colonies as kind of metaphors for the social world, and that brings out a lot of interesting things. But it also means a kind of reduction of the type of complexity that I think is particular for the social world. Which is the kind of meaning-making narrative and so on, which is a space that we haven't really been able to explore the complexity of. And I think that, there's all of these works like Gregory Bateson's classical Steps to an Ecology of Mind, and Polkingham's work about the narrative, like how we were living in a narrative world, how society is ultimately narrative. And this is something that we're altogether missing, not only with this method, but basically with any method where we have. And so this has been the topic of my forthcoming book, Seeing Like a Platform, and inquiring to the condition of digital modernity, together with Justus Outermark, which focuses on this, like, what do we miss when we use the computational lens to study the social world? So, like, what are we not paying attention to? And so this has been like a kind of the space that I've been in for a while, and it's the way that we're missing the kind of the cultural, the meaning-making aspects of the social world. And I've often argued for, like, in line with these scholars like Sayers, who argues that we need to have kind of humans in the loop when using NLP and so on. We like this type of interpretation. It cannot be fully automized, and computers will never be able to access this. What Polkinghorne would refer to as like the realm of narratives in which humans operate. But with large language models coming upon the scene, I've had to question my own bias a little bit when it comes to this. So I wrote one of the kind of early papers trying to, to be honest, I was kind of trying to show how limited large language models are when it comes to interpretation. Unfortunately, I failed because it turned out that they're actually quite capable. So this was, it's early 2023, so it was like decades ago, in LLM time. And so I wrote one of the first papers just looking at using LLMs for text annotation and text analysis for typical social science tasks. I won't go into too much detail, but the focus was like a task that I was working on in another paper. So guess the political affiliation of a poster. The poster is a politician. And this, so I looked across 11 countries, but focusing here on the US prior to the 2020 election. 12 countries, by the way. And I compared ChatGPT 4, which came out like a week before this paper was published. It was a stressful week. Expert classifiers, MTurk workers, and supervised methods. And so let's take this example, see some audience participation. So everyone was a bit tired after lunch. We didn't have any coffee. But so your task is this written by a Republican or a Democratic senator? It was published on Twitter prior to the 2020 election. How many Republicans in the room? So we have 5 Republicans. How many think Democrat? Yeah, okay, it's a clear majority for Democrats here. Anyone knows what this is referring to? So this is referring, so this is the explanation. So the answer is Republican, and it's referring to the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. So why am I showing this? Well, so this goes to show this a limitation that we've long been talking about within the social sciences of NLP, which is that they lack contextual understanding. They lack the ability to reason on the basis of context, and therefore, they're not operating in the same way as humans, and so therefore they cannot access the realm of human. Yes. If I would ask the LLM that? No. Oh, when I asked the room. Yeah. I'll try those next time. See if it makes a difference. Yeah, because no one wanted to come out as a Republican. It was like a bit ambiguous questioning. But yeah, so this shows the kind of, or it implies at least that the LLM is maybe engaging in that it has kind of contextual knowledge and that it's using that to respond to this question. And so this is another one. So Down Syndrome Awareness Month helps raise awareness for what it means to have Down syndrome and how individuals with Down syndrome vital role in our lives and communities. Who wants this to be? Was that the right question? Who wants it to be a Republican? No Republican. How many Democrats? Lots of Democrats. So sorry, you were all wrong. ChatGPT was right because it's a Republican and it's a dog whistle for anti-abortion politics, and so which is quite interesting because it makes sense when you think about it, but you probably don't think about it. And so this most humans and the supervised, yeah. So it does have the context, but the question is whether the training data is leaked in. Yes, that is a risk. I think understanding, having spoken to the kind of experts of these models, it's not really how the models operate. It's not very likely that they learn something that specific, and the data with them labeled is not publicly available. But yeah, I mean, but so the point of this is just to show that there's a kind of an ability of these models to reason based on implicit understanding, and like looking at the kind of outcome, we actually see that in this paper. So this is now it's like, oh yeah, well, cool, but you have to think back a couple of decades to 2023. And so actually finding that ChatGPT with zero-shot learning outperformed supervised models, and including experts with PhDs in political science on this task, which was quite interesting. But more broadly, I think for me, it also implies something when it comes to how it carries out the interpretation, because looking at the tasks that the supervised models and the LLM fail on, there's much more tendency for the humans and the LLM to kind of agree, and that they seems to imply that they're operating on a kind of similar approach to the understanding. And so that's the kind of background to this idea. Now I've talked, like the background has been like half an hour, but now we're finally getting to the kind of meat of the presentation. So this question of combining large language models and agent-based models as a way of simulating social systems. And so this allows us to get towards studying the kind of dynamics of public discourse, right? We can see how their interaction leads to new outcomes in terms of conversational dynamics. And so in this study, we build a kind of artificial social media platform, a kind of simplistic one. It's kind of Twitter in our mind, but it's not exactly designed to be Twitter. But it's kind of text-based platform with hundreds of ChatGPTs talking to each other. And then we are interested in studying how affordances and dynamics of the platform is shaping the dynamics of their conversation. And so this is like a quick view over of how the platform of the simulation is designed. So we use the ANES, so the American National Election Survey, which is a super detailed survey with lots of information about voters. We know what they vote for, but we also know like what TV programs, what they watch, what newspapers they read. We know like stuff about their hobbies. There's also these like feeling thermometers about like a whole bunch of things, where they say like, so how warm or cold do you feel about Joe Biden? How warm or cold do you feel about, yeah. And so we use this to create a description of a persona, because LMs love to play personas, right? And so we use this to create a statistically representative sample of Americans who use social media. So we create hundreds of these, and they can be Republicans, they can be non-political, or they can be Democrats. And since I know what news they consume, I use that to show them like the news of a particular day. So we're trying to simulate a specific day in 2020, just one day after the cutoff point of the training of the model. And so the agents are shown the news of the day, and then they can choose to post about this news on the social media platform. And so they write a comment about the article, and they share it to their friends on the platform. And then we have, I'm going to use the laser, the timeline algorithm here, which decide what the different users see. And then they see each other's posts and with articles that they shared, and they can choose to react on them. They can like them, they can comment on them, or whatever. And then we have kind of a cycle of that interaction simulating about 8 hours of social media, with the timeline algorithm deciding what messages on the platform are shown. And so there's 3 steps, as I mentioned, so just some examples of what was taking place at this date in 2020. Alabama students throw COVID parties. Black Lives Matter protest. Trump calls Black Lives Matter a symbol of hate. So that's just some example. And so the agents are kind of reacting on this and writing articles and commenting. And so this is some examples of the resulting dialogue. And so we've ran this, so we're kind of doing this now, but we ran a survey to see whether people are able to tell apart real world social media timelines and these timelines. And there's not really a difference in, like, people aren't really able to tell which one is which. So they are quite realistic, even though I think that they can be further improved. And so what are we trying to find out with the simulation? What are we interested in? Because it's cool that we can do this, but is it a useful method, right? That's what we need to kind of answer. And so the focus is this, because one of the most interesting thing on social media is this question of the timeline algorithm, the newsfeed algorithm, and whether it's polarizing or not, right? Like, what is it showing us, and can we design it to have less polarizing outcomes? So that's what we're focusing on, and we're comparing 3 different platforms, 3 different newsfeed algorithm. So the first one is kind of the echo chamber that I talked about before. So you only see posts from users you follow, your friends, and the posts are ranked according to the number of likes and comments, so the amount of engagement. So this is a pretty standard old school social media algorithm. The second one is the kind of what I call it the trigger bubble, or this kind of engagement-based platform. So here you see posts from everyone based on the amount of interaction. And then we have the third one, which is kind of the bridging algorithm. So this is our theory. This comes from the theoretical literature about how we can design social media to be less polarizing. So the idea here is that the algorithm is trying to create a bridge between the 2 political camps. And how do we do that? Well, it's based on the number of likes from members of the opposite party from the poster. That's what decides which posts are shown. So the posts that become more visible are, for instance, if a Republican writes something that resonates with Democrats or vice versa. Those posts are most shown. And this comes from this idea in part from Chris Bale, for creating kind of incentive and a way of, like, connecting the 2 political camps. So that's what we're trying to test. This is this alternative social media that we're imagining. And so what are we measuring? Well, I mean, I would like, and like the long-term aim is to come up with a kind of useful measure of democratic dialogue that is more grounded in this theoretical literature. But it's a bit too much to do in one paper to both invent a new method and new measures for testing it. So we're kind of following the existing focus on the literature, which is how much interaction do you have across the political camp? Are there echo chambers? And how civil is the interaction? Is it toxic or is it kind of polite? So those are the 2 measures. And so we test these 3 platforms, and what do we find? So the first 2 platforms, so we have the echo chamber platform. We see relatively low levels of toxicity. So just as a comparison, Twitter's average toxicity in English is 0.14. So this is using the Perspective API for measuring toxicity. And so we see that the echo chamber platform is relatively low levels of toxicity, but it's also very much an echo chamber. There's very little interaction across the political camps, which is exactly what we would expect, right? Then we have the kind of trigger bubble platform, which is much higher levels of toxicity. So it's as toxic as Twitter. Can you imagine this terrible place? But we do have more interaction across the partisan camps, but it's still kind of echo chambery. And so now it's like the exciting moment. Platform 3, does the bridging algorithm work? Yes. So we see even lower, like it's actually lower levels of toxicity than in the echo chamber space, while also having high levels of interaction across the political camps. And so this is quite striking, because, like, of course you would expect low levels of toxicity when people are just talking to people they already agree with, and they're just like, oh yeah, I agree, I also agree, but finding spaces for interaction that is positive and civil while having an interaction across the political camps is quite challenging to create. And it's quite interesting looking, because we can do a more kind of qualitative analysis of what they're talking about, right? Because this also changes which topics they're focusing on. Of course, it really opens a lot of possible studies, and we have a lot of questions that, there's a lot of follow-up questions that probably come to mind for you, and it also came to mind for us. Hopefully, I'm trying to get funding right now to actually answer those questions, but there is a kind of certain issues that are more bridging issues, and also certain types of conflict that don't necessarily, cut the political camps. Like there's some issues that political scientists refer to as cross-cutting issues, where the camps are divided differently. And so this connects to kind of this literature in political science that argues that, actually conflict and disagreement, it's not a problem per se. Like any plural society should have a lot of disagreements and conflict. The problem is when those conflicts start to align and you always have people on the same side in all of these conflicts. And this relates to this idea that social media is encouraging precisely that type of alignment. And so this suggests that this type of social media platform, this kind of algorithm, might discourage that type of alignment.
And they just talking about the weather, like cooking light.
No, so there is still kind of disagreements and stuff, but usually the disagreement tends to be less kind of partisanly defined. But there's also this kind of like HBTQ country music that also that's kind of but both sides are like, okay, there's aspects here that I'm like conflictual about, but I kind of like this, and it becomes this kind of meeting point between the two sides. But yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the solution, and I wouldn't implement this on Twitter, for instance. But I think it's quite interesting because it shows just the potential of the method to kind of, and the potential of defining the platform to shape the interaction in a way that can be more productive. And the point of this paper is mostly like, this seems to be a method that can actually be useful for studying how things could be different. And so we're still in the process of turning this into a journal paper, but hopefully it'll come out soon. And there's a bunch of directions we could take this in, right? Like looking at misinformation, the spread of misinformation is something that I'm looking at right now with a similar type of simulation. But I think it's also important to think about this as a broader kind of research method, because this is focusing on social media, but I think I think this method could be useful in a broad range of different domains within the social sciences, and it's quite interesting in what I've been highlighting, which is precisely like, so what does it allow us to see? What does it like encourage us to study? That's because the methods have we talk in the social sciences, the methods have a social life. They encourage us to do certain things. They shape what we see and how we approach the world we're studying. And I think that this method highlights how things could be different, right? And it suggests a kind of a more constructive social science, which I think is quite interesting. And the second point I would say is that it also, as an epistemic lens, it highlights the different types of complexity than what we've been focusing on in the social sciences. So when we now with LLMs, when we talk about the social world being computational or the social world being complex, it also brings in the possibility of thinking of that, of the role of meaning making and narrative and storytelling within that. So it highlights culture in a way that I would argue that computational social science has kind of missed historically, and I find that quite hopeful and quite interesting. And so, like that being said, I think that it also raises really kind of challenging ethical questions, obviously. So here we kind of used ANES data, so we used survey data, so it's all anonymized and it's not built around individuals. But I think the way forward will be to kind of create digital twins of social media platforms. So we use existing social media data, because if we want to calibrate and validate the model, we kind of need to do that. I don't really see another way forward for rigorous validation. And so that means that we kind of create, we feed the models, we train the models to mimic individuals on social media, and then we can have them interact and behave, in other contexts, which is like very cool. But ethically, it's like because then we can like, or we train a model on, like thousands of posts from an individual, and then we can ask the model, private questions. And like maybe the model is wrong, but I mean, either case, it's kind of ethically, I don't know, it's going to be a challenging IRB process for sure. Maybe we have to like carry out the research on some tropical island or something, but yeah, so I think it opens really interesting questions that we don't really have a framework for thinking about in terms of the ethics of this. So that's also something that, a discussion that I think we need to have. But like looking forward, I can kind of see two ways that this will paradigmatically shape the social sciences, because I do think that this is an emergent method that we will see a lot more of. And I see one way that's kind of has a positive outcome, which is what I've tried to focus on, the way that it's like highlighting the role of culture, meaning making, and discourse, the way that it creates a more kind of critical, constructive social science. But on the other hand, we've seen in other disciplines, like neoclassical economics, which has long been criticized in the social sciences for kind of confusing the map with the territory. That we start thinking that these models are capable of capturing everything that we're studying. But LLMs are not models of human psychology. They're not models of polarization as a phenomenon. They're models of, they're able to simulate a conversation, and they're pretty good at that, right? Like they can pass the Turing test. But they're not very good as broader models of human behavior. And so we need to be very careful with what we can use them for and what we cannot use them for. But that being said, I think that there's a lot of exciting space to explore when it comes to the capacity of this type of simulations. So yeah, that's it. Have a bit of time left for questions.
Well, thank you for your talk. I think most people will agree that this was a very interesting talk. The floor is open for any questions. Let's maybe start right here. And
Hello. I was thinking, instead of doing these to study conversations, if it's possible to use this to study how opinions are formed. So, for example, how in the Dutch election, migration became a hot topic because it was kind of introduced. And I'm asking this because this is more as asking ChatGPT what thinks is going on, that ChatGPT yet being an agent.
Yeah, so you're meaning like running a simulation based on individuals, like simulating society and how they will react to different questions and issues in the public debate. I think it could be possible. I would be like, a little bit careful there as well with what role we're assigning, like what we're assigning the model to do. But I think it's like I'm right now doing a paper looking at, there's this big literature on kind of the diffusion of misinformation online, right? And we often use kind of agent-based models with networks, and we look at how network structures shape how widely a certain misinformation topic spreads. And obviously, I think introducing large language models is part of that, where you give each agent a kind of persona, and that shapes, they maybe change the message as it spreads, or the message might resonate differently with them, or they might be of like elderly, for instance, that have tend to be more likely to spread misinformation. And so the models are able to replicate that, and we're able thereby to get towards more an understanding of this structural dynamics where the network structure has certain consequences, but together with the kind of the cultural elements. So how different individual traits and interests interact with the network structure to have certain outcomes. And I think that's something that will allow us to get a much better understanding of precisely what you're talking about, how different topics and different trends become a kind of focus of public debate in society.
Thank you. I was just wondering if using that type of agent simulation, could you see what happens if the platform itself is trying to push one camp or the other? Like thinking of Twitter, if the owner has strong political opinions.
Yeah. You're thinking if like one user would buy the platform and then just highlight their own messages. This is very hypothetical. This would never happen. Yeah, I mean, it would be quite easy to do for sure. Like, there's, I mean, in terms of what experiments we can carry out with a platform like this, it's like, your imagination is the is the limit. So many hands. It's like
there's time for questions. So
right.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. At some point, you mentioned that you wouldn't really apply or take your platform 3 to reality, at least not yet. And I'm just wondering why. Why are you against it right now?
Sorry, what I didn't hear that.
The platform 3 that you
Yeah.
were discussing in the future paper. I think you mentioned that you wouldn't actually make a social network like that right now, even if you had the means.
I mean, so the main thing is just that, like, the way the algorithm is designed is it's super simplistic, right? I'm just looking at, like, are there Republicans, are there Democrats, and like how far away from each other are they in the kind of hate space, and I use that, and I think that would be like, so how would you ask that? Like, you would like, hi, welcome to Twitter. Like, are you Republican or Democrat? It's going to shape what messages you're showing. I mean, yeah, but there, yeah. You could do that, but I think there are already better solutions than that. So actually, the Twitter community note algorithm, they have a really interesting solution for this, because it's basically like, so they kind of map all, like, what you're voting on every issue, and then they can kind of create a space from that that's much more dynamic, and then use that to say like, to use that to create a kind of algorithm that that defines agreement across different dimensions, because that allows you, it doesn't reduce, because this is very one-dimensional, right? But actually, in many countries, in most countries, there's not just two parties, and the dimensions of conflicts are much more complex. And I think even in the US, the cleavages in society are much more complex, and so we need an algorithm that's capable of kind of capturing that. So, but I mean, we could do that, like, it's not very hard. Just hoping the grant authorities allow me to do that, and I'll implement it.
Thank you so much for the very interesting topic. I wonder about the sensitivity of the evaluation to the model you run itself, ChatGPT versus the other, and the second, the impact of the last step of training ChatGPT, which is more about alignment and attempts. There are multiple attempts to remove that filter from open source one, like Llama 3, because they were trained on data, which is what humans say and contains some nasty stuff. But humans said that nasty stuff. Now we have applied this filter artificially at the end.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and this was like my first consideration. So in the since publishing the preprint, this is what I've been kind of focusing on, is implementing kind of uncensored models that are not aligned like this, because I mean, it is possible to do with ChatGPT, but you really have to yell at it too. It's like, be rude, like, behave like a social media user, and like, because it tends to go into this kind of overly polite kind of language, and especially if you're trying to make it hard to distinguish Twitter messages from like which ones are real world and which are ChatGPT, it tends to be quite easy, just based on like, oh, it's like able to spell and it's not rude enough. So I mean, the uncensored models are much better for it, and of course that's also the weighing of kind of, because the models need to be quite good, like they need to be quite intelligent. So that's been a kind of a focus, getting my university to pay for me to use a couple of good GPUs to run offline models that are uncensored but still quite strong, and then I do get much better results.
There were some questions there.
Talk. So a couple of things. The polarization of media itself is an interesting phenomena. So when you think of this network model of individuals operating through these platforms, there's in some sense these superstructures. So both the polarized media, which is definitely present in the US, but then also there's the other big supernodes, which would be state structures, government structures, both internal or external. So one question is, as you think of these models, how might those models be gamed when one thinks of these supranodes, so to speak, with greater capacities? And then a second thing relates to the political impoverishment, in some sense, with this discourse that diminishes. Because, of course, there's the diminishing discourse problem, but then there's the disenfranchisement issue. So I guess my second question relates to the disenfranchised. How do you reach and have discourse among those who've basically checked out and draw them back into the democratic process? Because in some sense, the failure of democracy may be not so much the polarization of a ever-shrinking set of people shouting across the aisle, but it may actually be the disengagement overall.
Yeah. I mean, like, yeah. So your second point really relates to this, like the response that you often get to any social media research, which is that like most people aren't discussing politics on social media. And my answer is always like, yes, but everyone who's discussing politics are also doing it on social media. And so in that sense, social media, I tend to come from more like a media studies kind of McLuhan perspective or postman perspective, making the argument that like media is important because it shapes our politics. It's media shapes everything in our society, much broader. This concept of mediatization, that like our entire society is shaped by media, and by the logic of media, whether or not we're discussing social media politics on social media. When we are exposed to politics, on CNN or wherever, it's still shaped by the logic of social media, because the social media defines what messages flow to the top. And so these algorithms ultimately kind of ripple through society and have really broad consequences for even like which type of political actors become more influential. Like Trump, I mean, he's like the reincarnation of Twitter, like of the Twitter algorithm, right? Like his behavior is designed to draw attention on social media platforms. Like that's at least a broad argument. So by changing the logic of attention on these platforms, we can shape politics more broadly. And the first question, I'm doing them in the wrong order, but is the question of kind of broader institutions and how different media platforms interact. And I think that this is a super important point, because the media, like Twitter, doesn't exist on its own, right? It's part of a broader media ecosystem, and the platforms are interacting, and you often see ideas spread across platforms. Of course, we can simulate that. is need a bigger computer, but it is very, very much possible to study those interactions as well, for sure. And you also mentioned there kind of the question of gaming the platform and gaming the algorithm. I think that this is super important when designing these algorithms, designing social media, that they're resilient, because we're designing a type of infrastructure, right? So they need to be resilient against the behavior of individuals. So that is also something to kind of focus on when carrying out the simulations. Like, how can these algorithms be gamed, and how can we build them to be resilient?
Okay, we have time for maybe two more questions.
Thank you for your presentation. And I have a question about data representativeness in terms of social media data. Like nowadays, when we talk about using social media data to do our research, specifically for your computational social science, we all know that like different social media platforms have different groups of people using, right? Like in terms of social economic status, in terms of occupations and different areas, digital gaps. So in your algorithms or in your models, do you have any method that to mitigate these issues, or how did you vision in the future, like we will use more and more this kind of advanced model? How do you think like this data representativeness issue could be addressed or become better?
Yeah. I mean, so the representativeness, I mean, because it depends on, we can talk about this in multiple ways, right? Like, so one thing would be, because a lot of social scientists are using social media as a representation of all humanity, and then kind of realizing that it doesn't work very well because it's a slightly biased sample, and like that can be a problem. I tend to like, yeah, let's not do that. Like, there's no way we can kind of modify or fiddle with the sampling to make it more representative, because it is a very specific cultural space. We should study Twitter because it is an important platform, because it is an important space in itself, not as a sample of something else. But I mean, the question also resonates with the question that we were kind of struggling with, because so in the ANES data, so we know how often they post on Twitter. We know how often they use Twitter, and we use that or on social media. And so I use that in the model to decide how often they're posting, how much they're using the platform. And so the models, the agents in the models are representative of the US population that uses how often they post and so on, which is highly, uneven. And there's a lot of interesting things there, like looking at the data, the more they hate the Republicans, the more they're likely to post. So this was in 2020, right? So now it's probably shifted. But this is an interesting point, right? Because if you would change the algorithm, if you would change the platform, it would also track the different user group. It would also change the dynamics of who's posting, who's interacting. And so that is something, there's a question with this type of models, like where do you draw the boundary of what you're modeling? And how do you decide what you include or not? Like, what's the dynamics you're studying? And so there's always those kind of difficult boundary questions in social science research, because there isn't any natural boundary. There's always kind of difficult challenges when it comes to what to include or not. Oh, we have to build a model of everything, which I don't think I'll get funding for.
Thank you for your talk. So this simulation actually reminded me of the Conway's game of life. Do you have states which are unstable? So when you run the simulation, you're kind of focusing on where they're getting polarized. Do you have states where you have these agents which are flipping back and forth, where they keep changing their opinions based on how long the time goes on, and there's not a clear-cut divide between these agents? And has there been any further study into why that is happening? Like if they're having constant change in polarization, because that could also tell us about a lot more things in reality. What could we do as human beings in platforms which may allow people to have differing views? So basically the question is, in your simulation, did you see any unstable states?
Yeah. I mean, so in this model, I'm not actually even implementing any opinion. So this is also why I kind of picked a time scale that's very short. It's just like 6 or 7 hours or whatever. It's like one day, because I'm making the assumption that during one day, very small number of of people in the U.S. population tend to change political parties, because I would feel uncomfortable using the large language model to decide, because that's an aspect of human psychology, right? Like, do you change your opinion? Outsourcing that to the large language model, I would feel a little bit, maybe it would be okay, but I feel a little bit uncomfortable with doing so. So this is just focusing on the kind of dynamics of conversation. But I think that you're pointing to like the fact of like the what was the focus of a lot of kind of complexity literature, such as the Conway's Game of Life, or cellular automata, or like this, all of this complexity research. You're completely right in pointing to that. This is what we now can kind of explore in relation to public discourse and conversation and politics, which I think is a super interesting space to be.
Well, thank you for your questions and for your answers. Let's thank again Dr. Törnberg.